So if there's one thing I've learned thus far from reading the comments of my videos, it's that Ager Scepter users, there are a ton of you. I've gotten a ton of requests to make Ager Scepter builds, and so here you go. I still feel like the Bleak Watcher build is the best way to provide room control in general, so I decided to take this build in a bit of a different direction. One of our Team Unity clanmates, Harvey, suggested that Agers may be a pretty viable DPS option since it freezes and shatters bosses a lot faster than Bleak Watchers alone will. So I went to do some testing to see how it compares to some of the other best options in the game, and oh boy is it viable. Just a fair warning, as with most of my videos, this one is going to contain a ton of math, more so than usual, so if you want to just view the raw results of the numbers from the testing and the build guide, skip to the timestamp on screen. But for those of you still watching, let's get going. So the main question that this analysis is meant to answer is, can you get Ager Scepter to outdamage a Reed's Regret without any kind of super fancy setup? Ideally, I'd like the DPS rotation to meet three main parameters. First, it needs to be able to outdamage a Gunslinger Hunter running Star Eater skills, Blade Barrage, and a firing line Typhon or Reed's Regret. Second, it needs to be sustainable enough in any form of damage phase. For instance, I'm not going to count a setup that requires you to do anything with ads during the damage phase, or any other wacky requirements. You should just be able to set up with your team in the well and plink away at the boss. The third parameter is a bit of a softer one, but I'd realistically like this build to require no exotic armor. My hope with this requirement is that we can create a Stasis Warlock build that can run Aeons so that we can match or beat the DPS of the best DPS combo in the game, while still generating ammo and running a control subclass. The first thing that comes to mind when we're talking about Stasis DPS is, of course, Font of Might. Usually you see it more on Titan since it's so much easier to activate on them, but in this case, Agers is actually going to make it more viable on Warlocks. All a Titan needs to do to activate Font is throw on a Glacier Grenade and slap it, whereas a Warlock needs to freeze an enemy, which usually means wasting time on throwing abilities during damage phase or having ads nearby. Even Duskfields have too short of a duration to give a meaningful amount of shards on long damage phases, but luckily for us, Ager Scepter can do it instead with the Catalyst. Ager's Catalyst perk grants it the ability to rapidly freeze on hit, allowing us to self-proc Font of Might by simply shooting the boss. In opposition to this, a Solar Hunter would need to either kill ads during damage phase, or spend all of their mods on time dilation to get just 18 seconds of Font of Might, putting Stasis Warlock at an advantage for Font. So now we have two weapons fighting against each other, Ager Scepter, which can consistently proc Font of Might on its own, and Reed's Regret. Before I started getting into the thick of it, I just wanted to know how Agers and Reeds would stack up against each other in the first place. If Reeds were to beat Agers by default, then it would be kinda pointless to try and continue, since you could just use Reeds in place of Agers anyway. So for raw numbers, Agers with the Catalyst buff turned on hits for 32.23 per shot, and boosts to 33.84 when hitting a frozen enemy, which happens about half the time since the Catalyst causes freeze on hit. Due to the change in numbers, I'm just going to average these two, since each number appears in almost the same frequency during testing. If you multiply by 1000 over 60, since Agers fires at 1000 rounds per minute, you get the DPS. My Reed's DPS number was acquired from my Banner Shield testing video, whose link is in the description if you'd like to verify my data. Since the equations used for calculating DPS are fairly complex with a lot of coefficients and parentheses, I just went ahead and used derivatives to compare their average DPS to simplify things a bit. And as you can see, Agers does indeed beat Reeds by a significant margin, which is great, because that means we can keep going. But we are still going to run into an issue. Agers will beat Reeds in the moment, but you can only fire Ager Scepter on Big Boy mode for just under 12 seconds due to the magazine size. At least most of the time. You can do a little trolling with T-steps and Rega's Refrain, but we'll discuss that later in the video. So what we're going to need to do is find a way to make a multi-stage DPS rotation to help complement Agers, and to keep sustaining it in the long game, while the extra damage dealt by Agers perk holds it against the Gunslinger build. Luckily, we have access to any legendary heavy in the game to help us do this, which gives us a ton of options. The big three that come to mind are Typhon with Explosive Light, a Rocket Launcher with Demolitionist, and just another Reed's Regret. So I'm just going to go ahead and spoil it, the rocket sucked, so much so that it didn't even make it to my final graph. But Typhon and Reeds, on the other hand, as you will see, were pretty solid. The DPS rotations were entered to the graph in stages, so you can better see how the DPS rotation changes as it goes along the graph, since we are using multiple weapons. The first thing that I tried was Typhon. I'm going to be pulling the Typhon numbers shown on screen from my Banner Shield video, whose link is in the description if you'd like to verify them. So first, let's get Typhon out of the way. In my opinion, the best way to use Typhon in this scenario would be to dump 6 Explosive Light rounds into the boss, and then swap over to Agers to deal DPS with the Catalyst perk, and then swap back to Typhon and finish off the DPS phase with that. If your team is popping supers during damage phase, which I sure hope they are, you'll be refilling your Explosive Light stacks during damage phase, which should let you get another volley of 6 Explosive Light shots off after your Agers damage phase. So overall, our rotation will end up being 6 Explosive Light shots, 12 seconds of Agers, 6 Explosive Light shots, and then you just keep firing Typhon. I'll also be factoring Radiance into the calculations, since this build is meant for a raid boss damage scenario, and more oftentimes than not you'll be using either Ember of Torches or Well of Radiance. So before we go ahead and build our functions, we're going to have to discuss a few math related things first, so first we're going to go over variables. The following variables will be left on screen to simplify the DPS equations. G is the explosive light buff damage per shot of Typhon, U is the non-explosive light buff damage per shot of Typhon, L is the Reed's Regret DPS without firing line, and B is the Ager's DPS with the Catalyst perk on, and S is the shatter damage per second, assuming the boss shatters once per second due to Ager's Catalyst. We'll be expressing the functions for each phase of the rotation as P1 of X, P2 of X, P3 of X, and so on. When evaluated with X equal to the total time to execute said phase function, it'll return the total damage dealt over that time. So next we're going to talk about reloads. I usually don't do reload speed when comparing DPS scenarios simply because we're only using one weapon with different buffs applied, but in this case, it's going to make a pretty big impact. So fair warning, this part gets really messy, so feel free to skip to the timestamp on screen if you don't care to watch this part. Since we're going for a function that can be evaluated over any domain for each damage rotation, we need to find a way to indiscreetly apply or reduce damage due to reloads in our equation, since a discrete function really wouldn't be possible to graph on most graphing calculators like Desmos. So here's the idea that I came up with. On each phase, our time variable x is set equal to the amount of time that's passed since the beginning of the phase. For example, if we're on phase 3 of a rotation and each phase before phase 3 took 5 seconds each, we'd set x equal to x minus 5 minus 5. Since phase 3's timer starts at x equals 10 due to the two phases before phase 3 taking combined 10 seconds to finish. We'll call this new expression that represents the time delta since a phase's starting point as the x substitution for said phase. My solution to the reload problem is simply to subtract the time it takes to reload the weapon from the current phase's x substitution, which will result in x becoming an expression that represents the total time of the phase, minus the time spent reloading the weapon during the phase. We can do this through the following equation. Our final x value is equal to our x substitution for the phase, minus the single reload time times the floor of the x substitution of the current phase over the time it takes to fire an entire magazine. If you're not familiar with Desmos' semi-discrete functions like floor and seal, floor is an operator that rounds a number down. For example, the floors of 5.1 and 5.9 both will equal 5. Although we're not using it, the seal of 5.1 and 5.4 both equal 6, and seal is equivalent to sealing. This means that Desmos will only subtract out a reload time whenever the function goes past the amount of time it would take to fire off an entire magazine. Since this is going to make our equations into a huge mess of spaghetti code, I'm just going to be referencing x as the current time in the damage rotation and leaving out the reload subtraction part until we get to Desmos. So now we can get on to the calculations. For phase 1, our equation is just 1.25 times 2 capital GX. Since Typhon fires 2 shots per second, being a 120 RPM grenade launcher and all, and is a stasis weapon which can take advantage of font. Just make sure to tag the boss with a freeze first, that Typhon will start with the buff. Overall, this phase will take 3 seconds to execute. For phase 2, our equation is P1 of 3 plus 1.25 times B plus S times X, and overall, this takes 11.9 seconds to execute. For phase 3, our equation is P2 of 11.9 plus 1.25 times 2GX and takes 3 seconds to execute. For phase 4, our equation is P3 of 3 plus 1.25 times 2UX and can go for as long as you have ammo. With all of these phases enabled in Desmos, we can see that Typhon isn't exactly the answer. It falls behind pretty hard when Agers get shut off. So next, we're just going to go take a look at Agers plus Reed's Regret. For phase 1, our equation is just B plus S times X, and the phase takes 11.9 seconds in total. For phase 2, our equation is P1 of 11.9 plus 1.25 times 1.2 times LX. Overall, the results for this phase are a lot more promising than the Typhon. After just around 14 seconds, our Agers build actually starts beating the Reeds plus Blade Barrage build and keeps climbing. So already we've beaten the Knife Throwers with Crow's Lunch Money and a couple of mods, but we can take it even further than this. So as I said before, the main limiting factor in this damage scenario is that Agers won't last forever due to its magazine size. And unfortunately, reloading Ager Scepter during Big Boy mode will turn it off, so that's out of the question. However, there are two main things that come to mind when we're talking about cheesing a reload perk: Transversive steps and Rega's Refrain. So first, we're just going to go over T-steps. T-steps will auto-reload your currently held weapon after sprinting for 1.5 seconds. However, the game doesn't consider this to be a normal reload since it's just setting your mag size to max. This means that you can just keep on blasting with Agers even after you run out of juice, as long as you just run for T-steps every 7 seconds or so. On top of this, Ager Scepter has a perk called Rega's Refrain, which reloads your magazine by 10 rounds if you get any stasis kill. This means that any unfortunate thrall that gets vaporized by the shatter damage coming off the boss is going to help refill your magazine. So bosses like Golgoroth that have a lot of ads nearby will allow you to continuously fire the gun to your heart's content. Since they have very similar damage rotations, I'm just going to be making a single rotation with a switch parameter that can turn on and off the need to sprint for T-steps. So for phase 1 of this damage scenario, we're going to fire off 6 explosive light Typhon shots, and that'll come out to 2 GX. And this phase will take 3 seconds to execute. For phase 2, we have 6G plus B plus S times X, and can go for as long as your superbar and ammo will allow you to. And if you look at the graph, it absolutely annihilates everything on the board. I've also made a variable in graph that can disable the 1.5 second reload time for transversive steps to simulate Rega's Refrain, and that just kicks it into overdrive. And so there you have it. With the build that I'll outline in a minute, you can dump a mag of empowered Ager Scepter into the boss and follow up with Reed's Regret to easily surpass a Blade Barrage Hunter with Star Eaters and a linear, all while using no exotic armor so you can run Aeons. If you really want to be extra, slap on T-steps to auto-reload your Agers when the mag gets low, and refill your super bar off teammate supers. If you got ads in the damage phase near the boss, drop the T-steps and just let Ager straight Rega's Refrain auto-reload the gun for you. So now let's go over a quick build to absolutely abuse this newfound data. So first things first, you're obviously going to want Ager Scepter. For aspects, you're going to want Glacial Harvest, and the other one's totally up to you. I run Ice Flare Bolts, but you can definitely make this work with Bleak Watchers if you want. For fragments, Fissures and Conduction are pretty much required, but for the others, I prefer Chains and Bonds, but realistically, they're up to you. For mods, we're going to want Elemental Shards, Font of Might, Elemental Charge, and High Energy Fire. The last mod slot's up to you, but I really like Heavy-Handed, Font of Wisdom, or Time Dilation on this build. The exotic is completely up to you if you don't want to run the T-Steps variant, but I'd recommend Aeons in most scenarios, and Osmiomancy Gloves if you need anti-barrier, since they can infinitely freeze barrier champions. Boots of the Assembler is also a good choice to crank up your damage even further, since it grants a 35% damage bonus to you and your allies when you're in Empowering Rift as long as Seekers hit them. While using Ager Scepter, every freeze will generate a shard for you. Picking up these shards grants you 2 stacks of Charge with Light, which become a 25% damage boost for your next 2 kills, effectively giving you permanent Radiance. You also get 10 seconds of Font of Might, granting you a 25% damage boost to Stasis Weapon. It's a pretty simple build. Just point and shoot, and Whisper of Conduction will ensure that the generated shards get to you, ensuring that your Ager Scepter sits at a ludicrous amount of damage. When you go for damage phase, just follow whichever of the 3 combos you're using, and all will be fine. High Energy Fire will also allow you to make your own Radiance, ensuring that you've got the buff every time you switch plates on Caretaker or swap orbs on Goloroth, while your teammates will lose the buff when they move. Shatter damage from the boss won't count as a weapon kill, so you don't need to worry about High Energy Fire going away from enemy kills if you're doing boss damage. I put the link to my clan's Discord in the description if you'd like to hop in and raid or just chat. After all, this video was inspired by a conversation with a new clanmate. If you like what I do, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.